Good evening and welcome to the last in our series of BBC events. The series Jewish Renaissance are running with the Lyons Learning Project and Insiders and Outsiders to celebrate and explore the BBC's centenary, in particular the Jewish contribution. We started off by looking at the anniversary book of People's History, looking at the contribution of Jewish emigres to the founding of the BBC and creating a world view. Since then, we've explored the drama, the arts, and last week, religious broadcasting. And today we're finishing off with possibly our most challenging session when we're looking at the BBC's news and current affairs output. I'm really delighted that I'm going to be joined to discuss BBC and news by Mark Damazer, who is the son of some of those emigres we talked about earlier in our series, and we will explore his personal background and personal career, as well as moving on to his thoughts about the BBC, present and future, amongst wider political issues. Mark and I are going to be in conversation for about the first 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open things up to you, our audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please do put a note in the chat box and we will call on you later on in the evening. First of all, though, let me introduce Mark Damazer. He started work in broadcasting in 1945, as 1945, sorry, I've just aged you by 30 years,
Yeah, no,
1975.
that was a genuine shock.
Sorry. I think I'm still in that emigre period
No, 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 no.
somehow. You started broadcasting in 1975 as a trainee journalist with ITN and moved to the BBC World Service in 1981. Since then, Mark embarked on a career spanning nearly 30 years with the corporation. During the 1980s and 90s, Mark edited the 9 o'clock news, becoming editor of television news programmes and then head of current affairs in 1996. In 1998, he moved on to work as head of political programmes before being made assistant director of BBC News in 1999 and deputy director in 2001. In 2004, Mark was appointed to what I believe was his favourite job, which was controller of Radio 4 and Radio 7, which is now Radio 4 Extra. And he remained there for 6 years before leaving the BBC to take up the position as Master of St Peter's College, Oxford, in 2010. In 2011, he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, for his services to broadcasting. Nowadays, Mark is the chair of the Booker Prize, and he's also served as a trustee on the boards of organisations including the V&A, the Carl Rose Opera, and the Institute for Contemporary History. But between 2015 to 17, he was also a member of the BBC Trust. I found his words on being appointed as a trustee in April 2015. And this is what he said. The BBC at its best is a force for enlightenment. It expresses noble ideas of impartiality and fairness. It expands cultural horizons and can make us think, laugh, and cry. It should strive always to satisfy audiences with great programmes and content, and should not shirk the expectations and responsibilities of its unique funding base. It will at times fall short, but it should never lose sight of its core mission to inform, educate, and entertain. So I will start when I start asking Mark about that Reithian mission, the inform, educate and entertain, both in his own life and career and the wider BBC. But I do think it's worth noting from the beginning that things have changed since then. So in the British Journalism Review in 2021, he gave a very different comment about the BBC, and it was actually a stark warning. So I'm going to read those words, and I think that's where we're going to end up later in our conversation tonight. So this is what he said in 2021. The power of the BBC has declined, is declining, and will decline further. There are obvious reasons for this, and it cannot simply be put down to ideological hostility, poor regulation, weak policy making, declining resources, or even, heaven forfend, BBC managerial incompetence and journalistic mistakes. There are other large forces that surround the BBC and weaken it. So that's our agenda tonight, Mark. We're going to talk about all the positive things and what you did to try and make the BBC great, and then what your fears are about where it's going. I hope that's okay.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me. And it's delightful to be here.
Okay, but I'm going to start by making the audience absolutely hate you, because I want to talk about your childhood, first of all. I want to talk about where you're coming from as a Jew at the BBC. And you said about your teenage years that your reaction to Morecambe and Wise was that it made you feel totally alienated and you didn't find them funny. Do you want to explain why and what your childhood background actually was?
No, I had a very fortunate background. I mean, I was brought up in northwest London, Jewish suburbia. Many of you will be familiar with that. And I had many advantages. I mean, my parents were an advantage, and I went to a good Jewish primary school. I didn't know, abject poverty or anything of the kind. We had a television set. I watched a lot. I watched the BBC a lot. I watched Morecambe and Wise and sat there stone-faced. And realized later on that there was a common national view of Morecambe and Wise, that they were funnier than Laurel and Hardy or Charlie Chaplin or Monty Python or anything you like, and they united the nation, but I didn't feel included in that. It wasn't a huge burden in my life, but I was always slightly bemused by my inability to grip it, with the exception, of course, of the famous Andre Previn sketch, Wrong Notes, Order, and the Glenda Jackson sketch, and so on and so forth. But recently in life, I've asked people whether I was alone, and I found out secretly that people have come out of the closet, and they have begun to say in increasing numbers that they didn't find Morecambe and Wise funny either. So I feel a bit less isolated now than I did in the 1970s.
Okay. Do you think, though, that reaction against them was because your parents weren't British and you didn't feel quite that sense of whatever British identity is?
Well, my mother is very much alive and is British from a Swiss background. My father passed away quite a while ago, it was about 25 years ago, and it was from Poland. Was my reaction to Morecambe and Wise in some way an obvious function of my immigrant background? I don't think so. It's my abject lack of a sense of humor, or at least lack of a sense of humor as it applies to Morecambe and Wise. I did think that Monty Python was extremely good, and I laughed at most of the things that other people laughed afterwards. So, I mean, Blackadder, Dad's Army, all that sort of stuff. Not the 9 o'clock news, we can go on forever. So lots of BBC comedy did make me laugh. It was just this rather idiosyncratic problem. Morecambe and Wise was the single most popular program that the BBC did. And in one of those BBC imperial moments, the BBC owns Christmas, said my good colleague, Alan Yentob. And in the middle of owning Christmas, the principal sign of ownership was Morecambe and Wise, until they went off to ITV and flunked. And I just wasn't part of the Morecambe and Wise fan club. I mean, I apologize for it, because I realize that even now, despite people having come out of the closet, I am in a minority.
Well, what I was really trying to draw out, aside from kind of your views on Morecambe and Wise, was if your upbringing as a Jew, and I believe am I right, your family were Orthodox Jews?
No. My parents both had Orthodox backgrounds,
Right.
but we were absolutely not Orthodox, but 100% Jewish, and Jewish identity was utterly central in my upbringing, and is still utterly central to who I am, but I'm an agnostic. I'm not practicing.
Right.
But if anybody asks me what religion I have, I say I'm a non-practicing Jew, but the word Jew is always there for lots of different reasons. So being Jewish and having been brought up Jewish is absolutely important to my sense of self, but I have other bits of my identity, and like all of us, I don't think I can be defined by one thing and one thing alone. So although being Jewish is extremely important in a cultural sense, in a familial sense, in a historical sense, not in a liturgical or theological sense, though we absolutely do, Passover and Hanukkah and so on and so forth. There are lots of different identities that meld into the person, just as it must be with virtually everybody in this call. You're not only one thing.
Absolutely. So, and Jewish Renaissance is very much a cultural magazine, and that's something we explore a good deal. So it's lovely to have you say that. Let me take you on though. So from that childhood, first of all, Northwest London Jewish day school, then sitting there as a teenager watching the BBC, you went on to Cambridge and then Harvard. Do you want to talk a little bit about your university experience and how it shaped you? And I believe particularly in America, that political interest drove your desire to become a journalist.
Well, I got lucky. I had a fantastic teacher at sixth form. We all need one good teacher. I went to Haberdashers' Asks, which is a pretty well-known school both then and now. It was a direct grant school. I was paid for by the state. Another one of my bits of good fortune, because I wouldn't have been able to go otherwise. So I was on a direct grant school scholarship, and I went to Haberdashers. There were many Jews, there were many non-Jews. It was a very high achieving school, fairly easy for them. They had a ruthless Darwinian system of selection of children at 11 and then focused them towards Oxbridge. And so if you didn't go to Oxbridge, you were somewhat neglected, but I managed to get in and had a great sixth form history teacher. But at Cambridge, I was taught by some of the most brilliant people of their generation by myself between the ages of 19 and 21. It was an absurd luxury. And I mean, I can't imagine anything more inefficient than teaching 19 to 21-year-olds singly in this way. And I was conscious of it. I mean, I realized that the people who were sitting there giving me hours and hours of their time, taking them away from their research, were some of the most brilliant people in the country. One of them is the cleverest person I've ever met. I'm still in very regular contact with him. So I was extremely fortunate. But the history thing, I think, links to the BBC and politics in the sense that, I had to do lots of different kinds of history, but the things that interested me most were between the 18th and the 20th century. And that gave me an interest in current affairs and the connection between the way events play out in the world, whether in the UK or abroad, and the historical lineage and physiognomy, if you like. So I had some sense of a likely career in current affairs. I was too timid a person ever to go into politics. My opinions were slightly too confused ever to belong to one party. I have instincts and prejudices, but I never felt that I could quite make it as a politician, and that I would be bound to produce whatever the main thrust of a party ideology was. In America, I went to Harvard. I had a pretty good time, and went off to work for a senator, a fantastic guy called Paul Tsongas, who was a Democrat from Massachusetts, much smarter than Ted Kennedy and much nicer than Ted Kennedy, who was a frightful guy in many ways. So I worked for Tsongas and was his foreign affairs speechwriter and organizers of seminars, and then came back in 79 and began at ITN in 79.
Right. So just while we're talking about university time, before we move on to ITN, I was really struck by a couple of things from your biography from this period, one at Cambridge and one at Harvard. So in Cambridge, I believe one of the people that you got to know somewhat was Enoch Powell. Is that right?
Yes. I don't want to, there's not much to say about this. I mean, the point is, it's not, I was friendly with his daughter, and as a result of that, who's an admirable person and very much around, as a result of which I met Enoch Powell. I mean, I should say, if there's any need to say it, I vastly disapprove of his politics and his political philosophy. I don't agree with it. I can see aspects of him that were clever, well-educated, and all the rest of it, but the basic political stance that he took to the world is not mine then and now.
And that's really interesting about political stances, because when you were then in America, I believe you were there for the 1980 election.
No, I just come back. I came back in '79 and started. I was at ITN in '90.
Ah, okay, because I was going to
Yeah.
ask how that experience kind of influenced, or sitting through that
Yeah.
election influenced your choice to go into news.
No, I mean, it had a lot to do with it. And working for a senator only, as it were, cemented my interest in political journalism.
Mm,
And given that I felt it was extremely unlikely I'd go into politics myself, I mean, from time to time I've been tempted, but I didn't, and I haven't, and I won't.
okay.
And obviously, whilst I was at the BBC, I was completely locked up into an appropriate straitjacket of impartiality and great care. Most people didn't know the way I voted, and I used to very much enjoy them guessing in different directions. I mean, look, since then, it's become clear to anybody who reads my stuff where my instincts might lie. But at the BBC, and until I left the BBC the second time as a trustee in 2017, I was pretty careful about not telling anybody which way I leant on particular issues. So the American experience was extremely fortifying in moving towards an area which was likely to be political journalism, even though I started, as we all do, having to do lots of other things, including, for those of you with a long memory, writing the obituary of the horse Red Rum, a touching piece of mellifluous prose about the three-time Grand National winner training on the sands of the northwest coast of England. I did Tito. I remember doing an obituary of Tito in which he kept on outliving all the obituarists. He was sort of dying limb by limb. I think he was like the Monty Python skit, you know, the Black Knight. I mean, limbs were falling off him, but the obituarists were dying before Tito. Anyway, I wrote I did that sort of thing
Okay.
at ITN before I left. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were at the ITN when you and I talked in preparation for this, you said to me you were at ITN by accident because you always really wanted the BBC.
Yes, no. Well, there's a theme there. I grew up with the BBC as being, courtesy of my parents, being a central institutional part of my life. And I mean, I suppose I didn't have a hugely sophisticated understanding of it, but it was just a very heavy influence. And I thought that it stood for a lot of things that made Britain a pretty remarkable place in my mind's eye, even before I knew other places. And it was a defining aspect of British life. I mean, obviously, together with the NHS and Westminster and the Queen and, the Tower of London and, the proms and this, that, and the other, British Museum. But I mean, the BBC was a very, very big thing. It's still a very big thing. And I thought it was a very good thing. And I still think it's a very good thing. And so it was pretty natural that I wanted to work for it, even though I didn't understand its anthropology and its mystique. It struck me as being the place to go and ply your wares. But when I was in America applying, I'd missed the deadline for the BBC's graduate trainee scheme. But ITN, now ITV News, but then called ITN, was open, and I applied there and I got it. So I started at ITN, and it was a curious institution, in some ways superior to the BBC. I mean, as a news machine in the late 70s and early 80s, ITN was better than the BBC, just did better news. News at 10 was a better program than the BBC's equivalent. They had some fantastically good correspondents. They were much more flexible and agile and sharp-witted. The BBC didn't start catching up until the mid-80s, and there were particular reasons for that. So I got a very good training at ITN, but the truth is, as you suggest, I mean, my heart was always in the BBC.
And you briefly flirted with the BBC before leaving it. Well, we'll come on to where you left it for in a moment. So I've just realised that must have been the 1980 election then, when you briefly went to the BBC.
No,
Am I right?
1980, I was...
Alistair Burnett.
Yeah, no, 1980 was ITN, and Alistair Burnett, who was the great, and I can say this now because he's passed away and I can't lie with the dead. Alistair Burnett was a great journalist, previously editor of improbably both The Economist and The Daily Express, a combination now that would be intergalactically impossible, but then was. So he did, I can't remember which order he did. I think he did The Express and The Economist, The Economist, The Express. Anyway, that was a very clever guy, and had a beautiful, mellifluous voice. And he was pretty inebriated by it late in the evening. Anyway, he was very, very good at presenting election programs, and I had just come back from the States, and I really knew quite a lot about American politics. In fact, I was teaching it at Cambridge at the time, but I was outmaneuvered by a guy 2 years older than me who brilliantly shoved me aside, and I ended up, instead of writing the briefing material and being Alistair Burnett's producer, I was employed as the person who had to crank the conveyor belt behind the set so that the hand of God, in this case Alistair Burnett, could drop down and pick up the copy. Reuters or UPI, whatever, saying, Massachusetts has gone Democrat, Illinois has gone Democrat, but Oregon has gone Republican, whatever it was. And I was on a chair, but the conveyor belt was very poorly positioned relative to the chair. So it was ergonomically an extremely stressful evening. And I ended up with a bad back and couldn't move. And had carted off by some friends and taken home with a locked back. And after that, I thought I better leave. And so I did, and I went elsewhere.
Okay. So one of the places you went elsewhere to was the BBC, but let's come back to that, because you actually had a little flirtation, didn't you, with TVAM?
Yeah.
That famous exodus of people I can afford. You were involved
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah. No, I was right at the beginning. I was recruited as one of the earliest, I think that we were called segment producers. First of all, it was extremely well paid. I mean, which was quite attractive. But it was hilarious. I mean, it was utterly useless. We were all profoundly out of our depth. And so the franchise, which had been given by the regulator, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, had chosen amongst the many people who wanted to do breakfast television for ITV, chose TVAM. And it was full of these kind of incredibly starry people then. So of course I don't know the age of the people that I'm speaking to here, so please forgive me. But at that era, Michael Parkinson was sort of mega huge first time round. He had a second coming. David Frost, just off his first peak, but with another 25 years in front of him. Anna Ford, who was the most famous newscaster in Britain, who came from ITN. Angela Rippon, who was the sort of most famous broadcaster for the BBC, reading the news. Robert Key, major intellectual, and with a long distinguished career, amongst other things, presenting Panorama. And they came, and everybody thought, well, that's fine. We got all the stars. In fact, they couldn't do live television either. They'd been used to doing lots of other things, but not serious interviewing, and with lots of different things going on. Reading the news is one thing, doing daily current affairs is another. Anyway, it was hopeless. Absolutely hopeless. The BBC, which was not first into the market, put up its own product, which was, of course, slick and brilliant, and we were annihilated. And nobody wanted to pay for advertising. Nobody was watching. The whole thing went down the tubes. Anna Ford threw a wobbly. There was a strike. There was a takeover. The lights went out. It was pretty obvious that the most important thing was to escape. It took me a year, but I mean, you had to escape.
Yeah. And you escaped to the BBC and then stayed there for another 30 years. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I went on a 3-month contract I wanted to work on Newsnight, which, so I mean, we might end up talking about this. I mean, the changes in these programs. Newsnight was then of nuclear importance. And I suppose the average audience per night would have been 2 million on an ordinary night. And it's fantastic. And John Tuso, who I didn't know at that stage, know very well now, but was presenting it together with Peter Snow. Fantastic. Donald McCormick, RIP. And I wanted to do that. Anyway, the BBC being the BBC, they gave me a 3-month contract to work on a program called 60 Minutes. I arrived and then it immediately sank. So cause and effect, who knows? But the program died a watery death. It was absolutely atrocious. So I came back from a holiday without a job. In fact, because of the BBC's maladministration, they'd forgotten to pay me for the job that I had. But I was rescued because somebody on that program, bad though it was, thought I was okay, and they transferred me to another program, the revamped 6 o'clock television news. And then I stayed, as you say, for a long time.
So you worked in the newsroom And then I believe you made it to Newsnight in the
Yeah, no,
mid-80s.
absolutely. Yeah, great. Loved it.
When the big issue of the mid-80s was the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. Will you talk
Yes.
to us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, well, we were all mad keen on, I mean, Newsnight was mad keen on going to Russia because it was such a crazy thing to do. You had to take an army of people. It cost the entire budget every year to knock out a film trip in the Soviet Union. You never knew what you could do. It was extremely cold and it was absolutely fascinating. So I went twice in 87 and 88 for 5 weeks and 3 weeks respectively with Charles Wheeler and famous then as the heroic, leonine, silver-haired, godlike voiced Charles Wheeler, who had been in the States for the civil rights movement and was a charismatic reporter of great substance. And then I went with Peter Snow, who's one of the still alive. Interestingly, they're both known now for their offspring. I mean, Charles was Boris Johnson's father-in-law, much to his chagrin. His daughter married Boris. Charles never really got over it. Peter Snow is, of course, the father of Dan Snow. But they were marvelous people to work with, and John Tusa and all of that crowd. And Joan Bakewell, I might add. So, I mean, it was a fantastic crowd of people to be working with, and I loved it. I mean, we went to film in Moscow for the great Thatcher trip in 87 before the election, when she lectured rather brilliantly, it must be said. The Soviet journalists who never came across anything like it were frightened out of their skin by this formidable woman. It was very cold, but we had a very good time. And then the following year, I went back for a Gorbachev-Reagan summit, but we did a lot of filming around it. And that was when we got Yeltsin to talk and say he was then in exile. Gorbachev had exiled him, essentially. So it was wonderful fun.
So you had this experience of covering what's happening, and then Mark Thompson, who's later Director General of the BBC, gives you a job, and I'm just going to kind of quote this description of what this job was. Smashing up the newsroom and making it better.
Yes. Well, I mean, I would try and use a more decorous verb. Well, Mark, who subsequently became Director General and then Chief Executive of the New York Times and all the rest of it, is a close friend, forced me. I was extremely reluctant to leave Newsnight, but he forced me off to go and join him because we were charged by the then Director General, John Burt, with he was actually Deputy Director General, but he's in charge of the news division. Anyway, he was unhappy with the quality and the editorial standards of the newsroom, and he wanted, I mean, I think a slightly vulgar way of putting it, and it is, to be honest, it simplifies a lot of complex issues, was to take it out market and to do more serious stuff. And the BBC was importing then, I mean, this now may all seem basic, but it was an extraordinary thing that John Burt, difficult bloke with whom I often had quite a lot of trouble, but he had a couple of major insights, one of which was that the BBC needed to employ really good specialist journalists who knew their stuff, and we didn't in those days, really. I mean, we always had fantastic political editors, John Cole and so on, but we began to employ people who really knew their patch: education, health, economics, housing, whatever it would be. And they needed to be introduced mostly from outside broadcasting, mostly from newspapers, and they needed people within the BBC to tell them how to do television. We didn't always succeed, by the way. I mean, we had some fantastic failures along the way, but we were there. I mean, particularly the later evening news, which was then at 9 o'clock, was the broadcast home of the specialist correspondents. And the DNA of the existing news machine was hugely against. It was generalist, human interest, a lot of royal stories, and we were much more interested in short form. There's only so much you can do in a half-an-hour bulletin, but in doing slightly more analytical stuff, more foreign stuff. We did a lot on Eastern Europe and all kinds of things like that. So it was a fight, really, between us and the old guard. And I simplify, I'm being crude, but I mean, it was a bit of that. I don't think we ever won them over, really. I think you find lots of people who were there who think that we were the biggest stuck-up prats you could imagine. And I'm not sure the Oxbridge background particularly helped. But anyway, we got there in the end, partly because we were supported by John. who stuck with us, and partly because we won over enough of these specialist correspondents who thought that although we were vulgar, given their own Fleet Street background, we were forgivably vulgar and we were trying to make it work. So it was a slightly proselytizing, slightly evangelical moment for BBC News, in which we were sharply differentiated from ITV, who still had very, very good production values, as they do to this day, probably better than ours. But we had a lot of editorial weight. And, you know, I mean, I remember when we left the ERM in 92, it's a staggeringly important day in British political and economic history. Peter Jay, very difficult guy, still alive, difficult guy in lots of ways. I mean, not meaning to be difficult, he just wasn't a natural performer, but his extraordinary authority in telling an audience of 10 million people what had happened, why it had happened, what the consequences were. ITV didn't have it. And it was the function of years and years of investment in specialist journalism.
I mean, you then worked with that idea of investing in specialist journalism. You worked as editor of the Evening News, you worked across all the TV news, head of current affairs, head of politics. So there was a big drive that you were behind in talking about the quality of the news. I'm very aware that during that period, well, there was, and going right onto 2004, which is when you then moved on to Radio 4, there were a couple of quite serious issues where the BBC was challenged. I mean, I'm going to ask you now about Lord Hutton and the Iraq War, because I
Lord
know
Hutton.
you were very involved in that and the coverage.
Yes.
But also, I mean, there was Diana Gate with Martin Bashir. There were
Yes.
issues where the BBC has been called into question. Do you
Oh,
want to?
yes. Well, I'll deal with Bashirgate quickly, because I was very fortunate. That is to say, when Bashirgate happened, no, well, first of all, when the interview itself happened, I was head of TV News. So I was in charge of organizing the news coverage of what Diana had said in the interview, and nobody interfered with us, and we did a reasonable job on it, and we had good correspondence, and it was fine. I saw the interview about 12 hours earlier than the public. So I saw it, I think, at breakfast time that morning, and I knew that, you know, the world would never be quite the same again for the royal family. It was obvious. I did not know, though nobody did at that point, how Bashir had gone around it, and I got lucky because I went into current affairs 6 months after Bashir's email scam had first appeared. As experts in the subject will know, it didn't get a huge amount of coverage at the time. It got some. His excuses were accepted. I didn't even know that he'd been, before Tony Hall, who was head of news, to be told off but not sacked, which turns out not to have been, in retrospect, the right thing, and so on. So I got very lucky. So I avoided Bashirgate, but then watched it all unwind last year with great sadness, because I knew a lot of the people. They're good people. I don't think they set out to hoodwink anybody, but they clearly were deemed to have mishandled it by Dyson, and I understand what that argument is about. I mean, look, the Hutton inquiry. So this is the War of Iraq, 2003, Andrew Gilligan, 29th of May, 6:07 on the Today programme. You know, the government knew that the 45-minute warning was probably wrong, repeated somewhat at 7:32. As you can tell, I have a PhD in this stuff. And Alistair Campbell, who had slightly cheapened his own currency because his complaints against the BBC's coverage, although not daily, were with such intensity that when he complained again about the Gilligan report, it took us a bit of time to realize that this was even more serious than a normal Alistair Campbell complaint, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister. But I could see that it was pretty serious and took it pretty seriously. And I was organizing the correspondence with him, but holding him off. And then the government scientist, David Kelly, died, and then the Hutton inquiry. Now, I mean, the point about the Hutton inquiry, it was dreadful. I was in court every day. The BBC Director General resigned, the BBC Chair resigned. I got quite close to saying goodbye to the BBC as well. And it was a tumultuous period. And we had made mistakes. In fact, not easily understood, but we coughed up in court about the mistakes that we'd made, which I won't go into in detail, but we coughed. The government did not cough up about their mistakes, and their mistakes were not inconsiderable. They had sexed up the dossier. I don't think, personal view, other people disagree with me, including people in my family. I don't think Blair lied deliberately when he said in the House of Commons that Iraq could strike within 45 minutes based on intelligence. I think that Blair had fooled himself into thinking that is what the intelligence showed, whereas in fact a close study of the intelligence revealed that it didn't. And the dossier was sexed up, and it was because Campbell, who I don't think set out with malign intentions, but the amount of pressure he put in the creation of that dossier led to it sexing up, and it was really significantly sexed up. And I'm probably being a bit generous because I think Alistair's foot was far too far down on the pedal. So there was that, and the government didn't cough about the fact they didn't give David Kelly protection. It was a very, very miserable period. But, and the crucial point is, and interesting, that because the BBC got slammed so hard and the Director General resigned and the chair resigned, the BBC's trust approval ratings ended up within 6 months higher than they were before Lord Hutton reported. The government never recovered. And as a seminal moment in the decline of trust in British politics, and I say this with no pleasure, it absolutely is part of the narrative that leads to many things, some of them, in my view, very, very bad, like Brexit. That trust and authority and legitimacy of government under pressure was seen to have crumbled. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The dossier was significantly sexed up. That should not have happened.
And I think what's really interesting about this, and you bring Brexit into the discussion, and I'm just going to touch on it lightly because I know already I'm seeing the chat and questions are coming through on this topic. One of the big debates that I'm sure we're going to have in the Q&A this evening is that relationship of the BBC to both reporting the news but shaping the news, and how does it carry debate, and what are the questions about impartiality, and what are its relationship to government. And I think the Hutton inquiry really brought all that into view, and what is it, 19 years later, we're showing where that has led to.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the BBC is, that was, thank you for reading out the quote at the front of you. I mean, the BBC is less powerful than it used to be, and there are a plurality of news sources in the UK, and a good thing. It would be terrible if the BBC was monolithically, the most important thing. We have a very large slice of broadcast news, but there are many other broadcasters, and then there is the whole of the big, interesting world of the web and social media and newspapers. And Britain is an imperfect, rumbustious, pluralist society. You can choose your news in lots of different shapes and slice it up in the way that you want, and that's all fine. The BBC is important, partly because it still has a big footprint. Lots of people still use it, and a lot of people do still use it. And they're not forced to use it, they choose to use it. That's one. And second of all, it has a reputation earned over the best part of 100 years for being largely accurate, largely fair, and largely trustworthy, all of which I think is true. A bit more than that. I mean, absolutely imperfect, mistakes all over the place, as you would expect from an organization that's producing that amount of output. But part of its influence is because people think that they can differentiate it from a lot of other stuff that's floating in the media market. And they like it, and they sometimes dislike it, and they can do all of that on the same program. But they broadly recognize that the BBC's journalism is animated by a spirit of fairness and regard to accuracy, and that there is something called truth, which transcends a lot of the flotsam and jetsam that you find on social media sites.
Okay, so this is raising another big issue that is already there in the chat. So I'm going to hold all those questions because I think we need to explore them in a lot more depth. And I know that people want to talk about them, particularly in response to questions around Israel, for example, around anti-Semitism, as well as around Brexit. I just, before I open to the audience, which I'll do in about 2 to 3 minutes, so please do put in any more questions you have in the chat and we will bring you up to ask them. But I just want to kind of finish your working career at the BBC. We do that because the Hutton inquiry came towards the end of your TV news roles, and what you moved on to was becoming controller of Radio 4. And everyone on here knows kind of that's my BBC. I'm a big Radio 4 listener. I know many people in the audience are. We've looked a lot at Radio 4 in this series. I'm just interested in why that was, as you said, your dream job. And if you talk about a couple of the projects you did there, I mean, what I know I'm interested in is, for example, Neil McGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects. So will
Yeah.
you just finish off this little piece with a little bit about Radio 4?
Yes, well, look, the BBC is many, many things. Radio 4 doesn't define the BBC, though it defines some of the best bits of the BBC. People misunderstand how big it is. I mean, the audience is about 10.5 million a week, and each one of those 10.5 million is listening for about 11 hours. I mean, that's before you get to the iPlayer. I mean, it's a deeply non-negligible activity. There's a lot of people, but there are other bits of the BBC that matter too. And the BBC is not only Radio 4, but the mixture of news, history, literature, poetry, politics, theology, culture, drama, the Archers, God help me, the Archers. I mean, all of that is, Desert Island Discs, so on and so forth. It's a fantastic gig. And what you get, I mean, this is what the job is. This is my definition of it. So BBC gets all this money. The Director General writes you out a check for about all in. So all staff costs, overhead, the Director General's overhead, electricity costs, transmitter costs, blah, blah, blah. I mean, say 95 million. I mean, this is 2008, 2009, 2010 or whatever. And then says, all these people want to make programs for you. Go and choose the best program, schedule them, make sure they're up to quality, bring in a few of your own ideas. So everybody's queuing to give you their best ideas. And this is unlike BBC One, where there is not much of a gap, really, to be honest, between the audience and the producer. The producer's inner ear is very attuned to the audience because they mix with the audience and they don't have to make too many concessions to how it needs to be put across in order to get a big audience, and so on and so forth. And these people come and they queue and they give you their ideas, and you go, I'll have this one, and this one, and not that one, that one, and that one. You then win lots of awards. They're their ideas. You go up and pick up the awards. It's a very, very nice way of making a living. McGregor was the best thing I did there. But even that, I mean, I don't want to overdo this. I had quite a part in its, I think, playing out. And, I could see it and I developed it and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't have the original idea. A producer at the BBC came to me and said, look, I think I can do something with the British Museum and Neil McGregor. What do you think? Went to see Neil. And he gave me about 5 minutes on the idea. And then there was this agonizing moment of conscience. Do I pretend that this is an agonizingly difficult choice for me? Oh, I'm not sure, Neil, maybe not, 100 parts. Or do I instantly go, that is the biggest single idea of genius I've heard since I've been here? And in the end, I couldn't manage the pretense. I mean, it was obviously such a fantastic idea. Boom. History of the World in 100 Objects, and Neil is Neil. And, one of the great broadcasters of all time, I think. So it was very good. I was very proud to have it and loved having it. So Radio 4 was very good, but I didn't want to die at the BBC, and I wasn't going to be Director General for lots of reasons, one of which I wasn't going to apply. So I decided that I needed to leave, or else I would die at the BBC, which would be a very bad idea. Me and some of them, actually.
Which is when you went off to Oxford, but you did come back to the BBC to be on their trust.
Yeah.
And I think maybe I'll hold that till a bit later on, because the questions are rolling in. And I'm going to start, actually, because we've just been talking about the liberal arts, the left-leaning Radio 4, and I'm using those words in inverted commas,
fine.
because they come up in a question from Rabbi Sybil Sheridan. So let's bring Rabbi Sybil on screen, just because that's a nice transition. Sybil.
Hi, good evening.
All right, thank you very much. It was a really fascinating insight, and I think we were contemporaries actually in Cambridge, but but we never met.
No. Well, good evening. Yeah.
No, I'm fascinated because, I mean, amongst sort of friends and acquaintances, the approval rating for the BBC is largely the sort of left-leaning intellectuals. So I really sort of query this question of fairness, because my sense is that the rabid right-wingers are not so approving of BBC, news output.
Yes, well, that's interesting. The BBC does a ton of regular polling and market research. and I'm not up with the latest figures, but I certainly have been up with them and I get the basic trend. The people who read the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Express and the Sun and their Sunday equivalents do not think of the BBC the same way as their editorial leader writers do. And there's a very, very famous thing, Greg Dyke, this is going back a long way, but the pattern basically is still broadly true, broadly. The BBC did this sort of survey in the 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 repeated, and then again 15 to 17 when I was there in the trust. And it turned out that although Daily Mail readers had less affection for the BBC than, for instance, the Financial Times and the Guardian, that they were miles ahead of where the Daily Mail ownership and the Daily Mail editorial writers were. It's always been the case. So although you're right to the extent that the BBC does slightly better in terms of overall favourability and impartiality and fairness with what might be called sort of Guardian readers, not by that much. And then famously, if you ask the BBC, the general question, is the BBC biased towards the left or the right, you get tribal answers. And by the way, those answers have become more tribal in the last 5 years, and certainly frighteningly so, which is that more than used to be the case, your party allegiance has some chance of defining some of your feelings towards the BBC. But even now, it's still the case that if you ask the general public out there what is their most trusted source of news, they'll say the BBC. And that's as true, not quite, but almost as true on the right as on the left.
That's so interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
So let's take that now into some of the topics that our audience is really engaged in. I have a message from Ruth. I'm wondering, I have a feeling that might be Baroness Ruth Deach. No,
Ruth. Hello.
I'm not sure. But we have a question from Ruth about the BBC's approach to anti-Semitism in Israel.
Yeah.
Could we bring Ruth on screen, whichever Ruth this is, and have ask that question?
No, it's a different Ruth.
Oh, it's not Ruth Deach. Baroness Deach has been watching some of the
No.
series. So I did
hello. I mean, it's still a perfectly valid Ruth. Hello, Ruth.
Oh, would you unmute?
You need to mute. You need to unmute.
Yes, and apologies that I got the wrong Ruth there.
I hate to disappoint you. I can't even compete on a sex basis with Ruth Deach, but let me. So my question is about the probe, the parliamentary probe that's just been announced into the BBC and its attitude towards anti-Semitism and Israel. I'm an avid TV news and radio news listener, and I've heard no mention of this probe at all. I'm just wondering why that is. Am I oversensitive? What's going on, do you think?
Well, you might be. It's difficult to know because we don't know each other. So good evening, and so on. I don't know whether it is or listen. If a group of parliamentarians is not a statutory body, it's not a select committee formal inquiry. It's still less a kind of judicial inquiry, or even a regulatory inquiry. A group of interested people in Parliament want to inquire, and so to speak, good luck to them. But I don't think that the formal status of it makes it in and of itself a reportable news event.
Was it Ofcom approved?
I doubt it. I mean, if Ofcom launched, it might be, forgive me, because you probably know more about this than I do. If Ofcom are launching a statutory inquiry or a regulator's inquiry, specifically around, Ofcom inquires into the BBC in loads of different ways, by the way. And BBC is very heavily regulated. And if Ofcom says we're so concerned ipso facto, or at least on the surface or something about the BBC and anti-Semitism, we launch an inquiry, I would say that probably is somewhere a reportable event, in lots of different ways, not necessarily in the 27-minute news bulletin, but it isn't. I don't think Ofcom have done that. Ofcom can make individual rulings about individual aspects of journalism, which, by the way, are reported. And they can involve any number of different things, including complaints about individual reports being not fair to Israel or Jews or whatever. But I don't think that the report, as I understand it, is of itself demanding of a place in a news bulletin or even a current affairs show.
Okay.
Yeah, beg your pardon.
I'm happy to be corrected. My understanding was that the JC raised a petition
Oh, sure.
to Ofcom,
Yeah.
asked for an investigation, and Ofcom suggested it. It may not be as
No, look,
full level
you may be right. If it were an unusual event that had happened, it probably would be worth something. I don't think yet it's worth a huge amount.
Okay.
I mean, 10,000 people on a petition, and forgive me, I don't mean
No.
but you know, the BBC. Look, I'm in danger of trivializing it, but just to give you a sense of numbers, when you know the BBC loses a radio service, so they lost in 2006. My esteemed friend Mark Thompson, in a theatrical move designed to show that the BBC was able to cut something, cut 6 Music. I mean, you know, there were 250,000 people within 24 hours. I mean, you know, it doesn't follow that it's going to be newsworthy. It might be, but I mean, I think really probably what you might be driving at is the underlying issues. And if you want to ask me, there's lots one could say about that, then I can address that. But anyway, let's see how this particular report goes.
Surely. Thank you.
Go on. They're coming up in multiple questions, so forgive me, I'm not calling on any one person, but let's ask you, Mark. Let's address those underlying issues. We've had messages about anti-Semitism, and we've had messages about the BBC's coverage of Israel. Do you want to perhaps take those things separately, or even?
You're all going to walk out now. So you know, I shall watch you dribble away at great speed. Look, I've thought about this a lot. For any number of reasons, of which my Jewish identity is one, but by no means the only one. I mean, just dealing with the Middle East as a journalist, as a current affairs commissioner, is a very complicated business. It's an extremely important story, very newsworthy, high octane, high profile. A lot happens and it matters around the world. Never mind about anything else that may go with it. So look, let me first of all make the obvious point that the coverage of Israel and anti-Semitism, and heaven knows we all know about the international definition and the vexedness of trying to work out where a position which is critical of Israel, stroke hostile to Israel, verges over into something else. So I'll make a couple of personal remarks that will orientate you, and then I'll try and deal with it. First of all, and I couldn't have said this, by the way, until I left the BBC for the second time, I have no time for Jeremy Corbyn in any shape or form. It's just not my cup of tea. And I was saying to Aviva last night, as far as I'm concerned, as a citizen, which is what I was then, by the time the mural comes up, it's one strike and you're out. The mural is so utterly outside any sensible grounds of what a political leader can allow to happen under his name, that for that alone, you know, for me, he was an illegitimate figure on the left. So what I'm about to say now shouldn't be confused with any of that sort of stuff. But I do think, and I have had a lot of time to think about this, I think that the Anglo-Jewish community, I generalize, has found it difficult to grip over many decades the change in status of Israel from an underdog nation set up on democratic and pluralist principles with admirable verve, zest, and with a huge legacy of the Holocaust and its history behind it, to a state which is seen, and not only by the left or the hard right, as being an illegitimate occupier of substantial bits of land with populations which are suffering mightily and often. Now, reporting that is bound to raise difficult questions for those people who feel an instinctive affinity and a reflexive solidarity with the state of Israel for reasons which I understand. And I'm a very, very fortunate person being born when I was born, as opposed to when my parents was born and what happened to their families and so on. I'm aware of my privilege, but the change in status of Israel, and I began to think about this the best part of 30 years ago. I remember seeing, and many of you will remember this, there was a woman called Hanan Ashrawi, who was Arafat's spokesman. She was very well educated, cut a figure, pretty good English. And she was the first PLO spokesman who could really make a case. And, they weren't all that good and haven't been all that good since. But I could sense then some difficulty in the way the Anglo-Jewish spokespeople were positioning themselves around Israel. So the reporting of the facts on the ground about what's going on in the West Bank and the conditions the Palestinians find themselves in is bound to raise extremely uncomfortable questions, to which the answer is not sufficient if it is that Israel is a liberal pluralist democracy and these countries aren't. That is true. To a significant extent, it's true, but it is not an answer. Democracies can do bad things, and they can be asked in a tone of voice that implies that there is a bill of goods that needs to be addressed and charges that need to be answered. And I don't think in the round, taking a long sweep, I'm not saying every single report, I don't think in the round that the journalists who've been on the ground in the Middle East have been guilty of bias or lack of fairness or impartiality or anything of the kind. So yes, an individual report here, the numbers wrong there. Famously, when one of the occupations of Gaza, the numbers of deaths was too quickly ripped off from some international agency with a vested interest. It was a mistake. But I don't think that the day-to-day reporting of what goes on in the Middle East and on the West Bank is anti-Israel, and I just don't think it's true. On the anti-Semitic thing, even less. I mean, I just don't see it, but I know that there was this recent incident where the BBC unquestionably screwed up, and it did, and I don't really know quite why. That is to say, the bus and St. John's Wood and all the rest of it. But do I think that the BBC is an anti-Semitic institution? I don't. And it's not just because I had a career there and Alan had a career there and Jenny Abransky. It's not about that. I just don't think the BBC is animated by the spirit of anti-Semitism. I didn't experience it. And it would be dishonest of me to say that I did if I didn't. I just didn't experience it. The reason why some things happened to me was not because I was Jewish. If I didn't get a promotion that I felt I might have got, it wasn't because I was Jewish. There were other reasons. I wasn't good enough, or I was unlucky, or whatever. But I don't feel it. So I don't mean to offend the audience, but I don't think that the central charge stands. I think it's not right. And I think that final point, and I was saying this to Viva last night, and it was a very, very big moment. So I knew Jonathan Sacks quite well, admired him. Some reservations here and there, but I mean, I could see the point of Jonathan Sacks. And, he was a clever man, and I liked him. Jonathan came on to, when he was chief rabbi, to do the Thought for the Day. By the way, the best ever Thought for the Day person, you could imagine, even better than Lionel Blue. Fantastic. Almost the only person who could do Thought for the Day, him and Richard Harris and one or two others, but, execrable. But he was very, very good. And he came on, and he was due to come on that day anyway. And there'd been some terrible incident in the Middle East. It was a normal thing. Hamas had presumably let off some rockets. And a couple of Israelis had probably been killed, and it was terrible. Then there was a big Israeli retaliation. Many people were killed. Humphreys says to Jonathan Sacks, Jonathan, you're the chief rabbi. I hope you don't mind me asking, what do you think? And Sacks says, it's something like 2006-07. John, the thing about Jews in the UK, around the world, 5,000 Jews in a room, 5,001 opinions. And, sort of clever, and we know what he meant. And of course, I understand the correct diagnosis of quarrelsomeness, debate, and argumentativeness, but it was no longer true about elements of Anglo Jewry when thinking about the Middle East. And then finally, and please forgive me, you've indulged me, and I'll stop at this point. Finally, along comes Corbyn. And what happens with Corbyn is that any self-respecting Jew who suddenly feels that they really do want to criticize Israel can't do it anymore, because you've got one of the two main parties being led by somebody who is so out of order in dealing with issues of anti-Semitism that you feel that you can't afford to give that person any comfort at all by saying something critical of Israel. So, the debate, which was already shutting down at the point at which Jonathan was saying all of this sort of stuff, gets shut down further. And I think that's the position that, as I see it and experience it and read it, that is the position at the moment. And the BBC is not in the same position. That's not what the BBC's job is to do, is to shut down debate and shut down reporting. So it's a very uncomfortable subject, because, I do disagree strongly with you, I think, or at least those people who think the BBC is biased. And it's a very difficult subject, but there it is.
Okay.
None of you have walked out. It's amazing.
We have someone who has indicated to me they want to ask a follow-up question on this topic.
Sure.
He hasn't actually put in the chat what it's about, but forgive me, I'm going to take a risk and call on Philip anyway and ask Philip Hyman. We're just going to do one follow-up on this, and then we've actually got some questions on other topics. So
I'm
Philip,
fine about it. Yeah, absolutely.
let's do this
Far away.
follow-up.
Hello, Philip.
Hello, Mark, and thank you for allowing the question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, perfectly.
Okay. I don't disagree with much of what you've just said. I absolutely love the BBC. I want to explain where I'm coming from. I worked for BBC Radio for 42 years.
Right.
Including I was one of your Radio 4 announcers for part of that time. So I've been there, I understand it. I love the BBC. We all worked very hard and we bent over backwards to be fair to everybody in what we wrote and what we said. You mentioned the recent event in London with the bus full of Jewish students who'd gone up there for the day. To find a report on the BBC about the Ofcom report on that, you had to enter it as a subject to find it, and the BBC had put it under arts and entertainment. It wasn't there on the general news website. Whereas the next day when you went to the BBC News website, there was a story about the Israeli army destroying houses. It's the difference in the strength of the coverage, I think, that upsets people like me who are fair-minded. Israeli government makes a lot of mistakes. The Israeli army makes some mistakes. I don't think they're deliberate, but if you look at all of the coverage and if you watch a lot of news and listen to a lot of news, it does appear to Jewish people that there is some sort of bias there. I'd like to say one more thing briefly, then I promise I'll be quiet and let you answer. Whenever violence raises itself in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we get a 10-15-minute package every evening at the beginning of the BBC One News and indeed on the World Tonight. It's a 10-minute package from somewhere where there's been some violence at the hands of the Israelis, supposedly. I've yet to see a report from Jeremy Bowen or any of the other reporters from an Israeli kibbutz or town or Tel Aviv or Beersheba as the rockets fly in, which they do every day. And I think it's that makes people feel that there is some sort of bias going on. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Philip. And 40 years is a long stint. Well, look, they're sort of two slightly different questions. Look, the first, I really don't know. Quite intrigued myself why the BBC screwed up, forgive the French, why the BBC screwed up so badly on the bus last year. I just don't know. Every now and then, you know, I made some mistakes myself, and the BBC, you know, does something completely. I just don't know it. I can give you a psychological guess, which is that when they first ran the report and it came under the first probe, this is long before it went to Ofcom and the BBC's own editorial policy unit, the BBC asked some of its own Jewish journalists what was being said and whether they could give some kind of opinion. And apparently the people who were then asked within the BBC said they were saying this. You know, the slur about the Muslims and so on. And it may have been that the BBC editorial management inside BBC News felt that they owed some solidarity to those Jewish journalists who had informed them when the report first came under scrutiny, and therefore the BBC just didn't think that it needed to do any more proper checking and allow for other points of view about what was being said to be expressed. I don't know that to be true. That's the best that I can manage. To the BBC's credit, its own internal editorial policy unit took a bit of time, but long before Ofcom got there, the BBC's own editorial policy unit said not good enough. And that was fine. And then Ofcom did the same and a bit more, fine. I'm mystified by the idiot who, I mean, sorry, in inverted commas, I really, really don't know why they did that. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that an organization that gives as much time to Holocaust Memorial Day, far more than anybody else, and sponsors Holocaust survivors to do arts projects, which the BBC does, and does the amount of programming overall the BBC does about Holocaust and survival, not least fantastic documentary that Arthur Carey did last year and so on. I just think it's extremely unlikely that it's reflective of an institutional mindset. But I do think it was a bizarre and stupid error. Fine. Look, where it appeared in terms of its news values and how prominent it was, I don't know. Philip, I take your word for it. And I just can't, I can't do that. I don't know. It went somewhere. I came across it, so it couldn't have been that obscure, but maybe I have a special interest. I disagree with you on the Bowen stuff. I mean, Jeremy and Orla and all of them, I've seen loads of reports, which after one of these cycles of atrocity, when Hamas does something, Israel retaliates, Israel goes into Gaza, Hamas retaliates, all the rest of it. I've seen tons of stuff which have taken the Israeli point of view into account. From time to time, there will be good reason why it doesn't, which is that the incident has only happened or the numbers are so wildly disproportionate, because it's a tragic fact that the number of Palestinians, not to say that Hamas don't start it a lot of the time, because I'm not saying that they don't start it a lot of the time. I know perfectly well, A, that they do, and B, why they do. But the fact is, it's just a fact that the amount of people killed in these cycles of attack are not remotely proportionate. And we all know that, we all know why that's the case. So I don't accept, forgive me, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't accept the premise, which is that the schools and the kibbutzim are not featured in coverage, maybe not every time, but I've seen, honestly, and commissioned myself, hundreds of those pieces. So on that one, I sharply do disagree with you, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm actually going to leave this topic there because I suspect this is what it is on both sides. But you've given us a lot of room for thought, and I think Philip's question has as well. I will just pick up on one comment in the chat, which is about the amount of coverage about Jewish topics. So Judy Herman, who is our arts editor, but also was a BBC Radio 4 producer for many years, put in the chat, and forgive me for not calling you on you, Judy, but we've got many more questions. But she said, it can't be my imagination that there are must-listen radio programmes of Jewish interest almost daily. Take the last 3 days, for example. Saturday night, Brian Cox and Robin Inst devoted Radio 4's The Infinite Monkey Cage to a discussion called The Age of Conspiracy with David Baddiel. Radio 3's Sunday feature was Shostakovich and the Battle for Bab Yar, and that was unmissable. And today on Radio 4, there was Bad Blood, the story of eugenics, about the Nazi programme of sterilisation and genocide. So just to back up what Mark is saying there, thank you, Judy. And BBC Sounds, you should be able to play all these programmes if anyone's interested.
Yeah.
But we have just a little while longer, and I will close it by 9:30. We try and keep to time here. But there are two very different kinds of questions coming through that I want to bring up. So I'm actually going to bring in Emma Brand from Lyons Learning, because I said at the beginning we'd come back to maybe the questions about Brexit, about Europe, about the Conservative government, and Emma has questions around this. So
Hi, Emma. Hi.
Thank you very much. This has all been really fascinating. So yeah, what Sybil said earlier was quite interesting to me, because from my perspective, I'm probably, my associates, I would say, are more on the left and obviously a younger generation. And I would say most of the criticism of the BBC from people I know is that it's biased in the other direction, which probably shows it's doing a fairly good job. But the criticism that comes up again and again is that it feels like BBC journalists lack bite when it comes to taking on the government in a way that, maybe Channel 4 and ITV seem to be bolder in their scrutiny and criticism. And yeah, I was wondering if that's something that rings true for you. And also, if there is a reticence there, is that to do with like the fear of losing funding?
Yes, no, that's a perfectly fair question. And I mean, difficult to give a absolutely scientifically evidence background. Look, at its best, and there's plenty at its best. I mean, Nick, Justin, Michelle, Amal, on the Today programme. Nick's interview, if you can get hold of it, I can't remember what day it was. Nick's interview with Kwasi Kwarteng, when in that brief period, you will remember it, when Kwasi Kwarteng was Chancellor of the Exchequer, is just one of the great interviews of all time. Laura is extremely good on the Sunday show, as Andy was before. I mean, there are plenty of really tough-minded and well-informed. Sarah, rather wonderful. Evan, rather wonderful. There are loads and loads and loads and loads of really, good interviewing broadcasters. Emily Maitlis is a whole subject in and of itself. We can go there separately if you want. I strongly disagreed with her famous introduction to the Dominic Cummings programme. I think that she was way the wrong side of the line. I don't think it's got anything to do with being soft on the government. I think that she was considerably mistaken, despite her talent, in her understanding of where BBC impartiality lies. The Panorama stuff is still churning out things which are extremely uncomfortable for the government and all the rest of it. Look, Channel 4 News is very interesting. I watch it a lot. It's a minority sport. I mean, figures count here. Channel 4 News, 350,000 a day, maybe. Quite a bit more floating around its ecosystem on the website. But really, it's a very, very interesting, good news program. As a consumer, I use it probably more than I use the BBC Nightly News, but it's a small audience. If you add the BBC's main news bulletins together, it's many, 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 many times that. And you're doing different things. I don't think that Channel 4 News is very interesting because each individual item is defensible, but in the round, Channel 4 News comes at the world with quite an obvious point of view. And perspective, and it's a different form of impartiality to the BBC's, and there's room for both. But I don't think that if the BBC did what Channel 4 News does, I don't think it'd work. We are not the same as a national newspaper with an editorial point of view. We have to be fair-minded to allow scrutiny and challenge and reporting of multiple points of view. And for some people who want the BBC to take a position, isn't it obvious that the BBC is outraged by Floyd, why the death of, and why isn't the BBC therefore putting a Black Lives Matter logo on the screen? Why is the BBC so worried if its reporters say that Trump is a racist? Why isn't he just called out? They're human beings, they must have a point of view, so the BBC should express that in the way that you would comfortably do that on a newspaper or probably on Channel 4 News. And the answer is that's not what the BBC does. And the price for the trust is to be able to demonstrate fair-mindedness in which the truth trumps all. If you've got something that's true, balance doesn't come into it. You don't have to be balanced between the world is round and the world is flat, or that Boris Johnson said about the Northern Ireland Protocol when he signed it, that there would be no border controls when there were. That was an outright mistake, untruth, call it what you want. It's fine, you can say that. But the BBC, if you want really strong flavors in your daily journalism, then the BBC may not be the right place for it. But it doesn't stop all the people I listed at the front doing fantastically good things by revealing the truth and broadcasting the truth and doing tough-minded interviews. So I can see that the stronger flavors are available elsewhere. And it's a little old-fashioned for me to say that you leave your politics on the coat stand and you come in and you try and look at the world with at least some intellectual sympathy and understanding for more than your own point of view and make sure that that's expressed in the coverage. So it's a slightly old-fashioned view. It's the one that Tim Davey has. I have it. I think it's worth fighting for, but I can see that it will leave some of the younger audience cold. That's one. Do I think that the BBC adopts the position it does because of its fear of funding? No, but I think that the whole mechanism of the BBC being a license fee funded broadcaster, which you all have to pay for, means that we have obligations in the way that we interpret fairness and impartiality, which lie more heavily on the BBC than they do on other broadcasters. And that's life. I don't regret it. I chose to make my career there, at least most of it. And I think it's a reasonable requirement that the BBC has to do this. And that comes back to why what Emily Maitlis did would have been okay on Channel 4 News, and she would not have got into trouble about it. And she didn't get into much trouble anyway, because the BBC doesn't dosh out massive doses of trouble. There was a certain amount of hype about the trouble. She was in no real trouble, but she shouldn't have done it. I'm a talented woman though she is. It was a mistake.
Okay. So I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, because we've got questions coming in, including one from Irene Wise about opposing views and how one frames that no matter how small the minority viewpoint.
Yeah.
And I'm preparing for this interview. I've read quite a lot of your writing, including, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was an article you wrote for Prospect about the coverage of Brexit, where you talk about how actually the BBC, in trying to be even-handed, probably amplified those pro-Brexit voices more widely. And you talked about kind of what do we do when things are factually incorrect. You gave a blue banana example, and you did suggest some solutions. You weren't into us becoming this kind of CNN fact-checking Donald Trump, but you did begin to think about the BBC and what it should be doing around statistics, for example, and challenging people who speak. So what would you like to see happen to kind of take the BBC forward that strengthens both its impartiality and its kind of voice of the nation role?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, look, on Brexit, actually, I take, again, a slightly, I'm not sure about this audience, but I mean, I take a heterodox view. I disagree with the chair of the BBC, by the way, last week, whose formulation, when he was talking about impartiality, I wasn't immediately struck by. I think he was wrong. I don't think the BBC was miles out with Brexit in terms of impartiality. I don't think the impartiality was really the issue. I thought quality was the issue, and that's not the same thing. You can be impartial and not really very ambitious in your journalism. And you can be impartial and ambitious and strive for higher quality and a high level of public debate. And my concern was not that the BBC was broadly fair. I thought the BBC was broadly fair. Some howlers here and there, and I can go into them, but broadly fair. But I think that there were real problems. So Viva's pointed out one. I mean, I think if you go into this vox pop journalism, which I don't much like, it's no good. Actually, funnily enough, I heard something today, I think it was on Channel 4 News, which was illustrative of the same problem. There was a pensioner. So forgive me, because this is a general point, and then I'll work it back to Brexit. This was just tonight on Channel 4 News, and a pensioner was vox popped because she was suffering under the cost of living crisis. That's fine. Stick a mic in front of her, and she said, it's terrible because, prices are going up and pensions are going down. They're not going down. There's a triple lock, and pensions are not going down. Pensions have been going down much less than anything else, and probably not going out at all. They've been the most protected part of the population. It's just an uncomfortable truth, but it's true. Pensions are protected in a way that loads of other people's pay are not. So she says this, and then moves on to another vox pop. Now, it's just not true. But the grammar of the television news bulletin, this comes to the Brexit point, means that you don't challenge it. So BBC reporters would go into pubs and interview people about Brexit who would say things about whatever it might be, the immigration figures or the amount we were paying into the European Union, or, EU red tape, or the EU is responsible for this, that, and it's simply not right. It's not. There's still other reasons why you might want Brexit. You might have a particular view of sovereignty, and you might care passionately about the regulation of the biosciences industry, and you don't want to see the Poles do all this sort of stuff. It's okay, but people are allowed to say things which are not true. And because they're members of the general public saying it in the form of a vox pop, they're not challenged in the way that if they were a politician, they would be. And that does not work. And the industry, now getting on for, 100 years old, has still not sorted that out. It's a major problem with broadcast news. People should not be allowed to say stupid things and be forgiven for them just because they're members of the general public. It doesn't give them an automatic right to say things which are not true and then not to be challenged about it. So that was one problem with the coverage. And it probably was true on both sides, but it struck me a lot of the time. I was hearing people say things which were simply factually incorrect. The Northern Ireland Brexit coverage, that is to say the 2016 coverage about what the consequences would be for Brexit in Northern Ireland, was very poor. And honestly, those of us who knew the story knew there's going to be trouble. And you couldn't square a circle. There was going to have to be a border somewhere, and it was probably going to be in the Irish Sea. The BBC did very poorly with that. Others did as well, but the BBC has higher standards, and it was very poor. BBC's use of statistics improved, but still often crazily ridiculous. They throw a sum of money onto the air and say, you know, we're spending £300 million more on this. Well, is £300 million a lot or little? It depends what it's on. £300 million on health spending is absolutely peanuts. You know, £300 million on a road scheme down the road, a lot of money. But the reporters very often don't give themselves the luxury of trying to explain that to the audience. So I think the issues around the journalism for me are not about fairness or impartiality, where I think the BBC is still pretty good. No, more than that, really very good. They try very, very hard, and then they screw up from time to time. And we talked about one tonight. The issues are whether it's ambitious enough and whether the quality is high enough, and whether it is slightly suffocatingly in love with the experiential. That is to say, I need to see people suffer on the screen, and I need their human experience, and I must tell a story because otherwise the audience won't follow it. So of course, to an extent, that's right, but there is a limit to how much you can repeat that formula and not give people the analytical grit. And I think the BBC needs to aim higher for itself, and not only in Brexit, but in general, in its coverage, even in its mass news bulletins. And, you know, clearly the Today programme does better. It should do. It's got more time, and its audience probably is somewhat differently configured. But the BBC's journalism needs to be more ambitious than it does, and that very much includes the use of statistics. So I agree with that.
Okay, thank you very much. And just a small note for anybody who's watching who's interested in this. Mark mentioned disagreeing with the current BBC chairman who put out a statement last week. So that chairman, Richard Sharp, who is a mentor to Rishi Sunak, amongst having had other roles, he's also Jewish, which is kind of throws an interesting thing.
And not the first. I mean, there have been loads of, I mean, you know, Michael
Yeah.
Grade was with whom I don't agree about very much. Michael Grade, Richard Sharp, we can think of more. Let me just think. There have been, you know, there's Stuart Young, who was no good, but there we are. He was no good, not because he was Jewish. He was no good. He was just no good. Yeah, I mean, look, Richard Sharp was a legitimate choice. Let's make it clear. I had been very vigorous in my opposition to Charles Moore becoming chair of the BBC and Paul Dacre becoming chair of Ofcom. I thought that was ludicrous. You might as well put the Pope in charge of the local brothel. I mean, it was an absolutely ridiculous thing to do. And I'm very glad they didn't make it. And I did not raise a finger, write a piece, brief a journalist in any negative way about Richard Sharp. And I think he gets the BBC on the whole. And so I'm not here to say all of that, but I thought that the way he talked about impartiality last week was not very impressive or subtle. It was the zeitgeist that he was replaying back, possibly because he felt that he needed to say that. But I know the Brexit coverage quite well, and the fact that the result was what the result was does not mean that the BBC in some way missed it. Everybody reported the opinion polls. The opinion polls all said narrow victory, not even a big victory, narrow victory for Remain. It was a narrow victory for Brexit. Does that make the BBC miss the public mood or wrong? No. So I think that was a slightly clumsy formulation on his part, but I'm not objecting to his chairmanship.
Thank you for that clarification. Talking about chairmanships, we've only got time for one last question. So I know one of the people who has a question is actually the chairman of Renaissance Publishing, the board that publishes Jewish Renaissance. So I'm going to bring Ian on to ask both his question about the BBC and then maybe do the vote of thanks. Ian.
Hi.
Thanks, Aviva. Mark, thank you for a fascinating session. Early on in this session, you referred to the BBC as a good thing. I would say that one of the best things about the BBC is the World Service. Actually wonderful now that we can listen to it in this country as well.
Mm.
Do you think there's ever any chance that the funding of the World Service will revert to what, in my view, should be its proper home, i.e. the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, instead of it having to be funded from the BBC's own budget?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Let's just do a couple of minutes of this. So the history of this, for those of you who don't know, is that until about 2010, I think it was the 2010 license fee settlement, the BBC was funded by a direct grant from the Foreign Office. In theory, disastrous, because it meant that everybody in theory around the world could say, look, it's a government funded thing. It doesn't even have this protective veil of the license fee. Amazingly, people didn't bother much with that critique because it was just so obviously a superior product compared to other international broadcasters that it just didn't work as an attack line against the BBC. In 2010, the first of the austerity budgets, the BBC was handed the problem of how to fund it. And it's not completely funded now because after about 5 or 6 years, the government wanted the BBC to open up more services to individual countries which needed it. Particularly increase investment in Afghanistan, blah, blah, blah. And so they paid for that. So it's a sort of slightly hybrid model, but I mean, Ian is right. The bulk of it comes from the license fee. Now comes an interesting question. If we're going to get rid of, I wouldn't worry about it being connected to a television set, the idea of a fee. The debate is not about a TV license fee, really. It's about whether you all pay something for the BBC so that you all own it, so that it has these huge economies of scale, and that you're all forced to pay for it, and then you get fantastic value for it. Is it that, which is currently the state of play, you all pay for it, except those of you over the age of 75 on pension credit, and you all own it, and you can all shout at it, and you can all be annoyed about it because it's yours, and it has all these obligations? Or is it to become something where a bit of it everybody pays for, posh bits, news, some documentaries, probably most of Radio 3, the proms, upmarket this, upmarket that, but everything else is paid for by subscription, which is where the government probably wants to go. I don't want to go there. And there are many reasons why I don't want to go there, but that is the direction of travel. And I suppose the BBC is under an obligation to think through how that might work, but I think it's a good idea. And in that scenario, who funds the World Service? Interesting. I suppose it would come out of that bit that would be the license fee, because it would be considered to be so obviously worthy and virtuous that it would be market failure and it would be financed by what remains of the license fee, but there is a risk. If not, then the government is going to have to do as Ian suggests and take it back in, because I don't think even this lot, well, what do I mean by even this lot? I mean, Sunak is clearly considerably more sane than his two predecessors, but he's still, in my view, ideologically, and his culture secretary, ideologically, hostile and imperiling the BBC, often in the teeth of evidence, based on their own particular insights into BBC programming and impartiality, based on not much more than intuition plus prejudice. So I think that the BBC is under really considerable threat, and it disturbs me because although I scream at it and it infuriates me vastly, and could be much better in various different ways, including using current affairs that we've talked about, it's a magnificent enterprise, noble in its failure because it's impossible to be impartial all the time and do everything of high quality, no matter what it is that you're doing on smaller budgets. But it is one of those things that makes Britain a civilized place. And, there are cliches about repent at leisure, act in haste. You can't recreate it. I mean, once you've hacked it apart and you've decided that popular entertainment goes into a subscription service and Match of the Day goes into a subscription service, the magic is gone. And, the BBC will manage to get a subscription base, but it won't, it'll harm the rest of the industry outside the BBC. It'll put people into two categories, posh people who can afford to pay for everything if they want to, and other people who have to pay extra. And it won't take long before they're paying more than the license fee is at the moment. So I think it's an extremely bad idea, but unless people are prepared to fight for the idea on the left and the right, then it's under very severe threat. And I think that is very, very bad. Very bad, both for the BBC and for national public life and for Britain. It's one of the greatest instruments of soft power ever created.
That begs the question, how do we fight for it? But I think we'll have to...
Well, look, I mean, it's an imperfect democracy, this. Here's a couple of quick stories of my mind. I mean, when I was on the trust and we were trying to work out what we wanted for the license fee without realizing we were going to get ambushed all over again by George Osborne and so on, we did all these studies, and then the government did a consultation, and then it found out that it was going the wrong way. So they scrapped that consultation because people were far too favorable towards the BBC. And if you did it by a national vote with a reasonable degree of sophistication, because nobody will straight out say they like paying 159 quid. But in all these deprivation studies where people, which are properly run independently, by the way, where people are deprived of the BBC, their feelings about the BBC are measured at the before and end of the experiment. 80% turn out at the end of the experiment to be far more favorable to the BBC once they're deprived of it. Now, yeah, that's quite a margin. And if it were, I think, a plebiscite, I think the BBC would probably be largely intact. But that's not the way it works. But the best that you can do is, write to your MP, particularly if it's a government MP, and say, yeah, I too get furious about the BBC in the following ways, but taking it in the large, what you're doing is behaving like vandals. You're not behaving like conservatives. Conservatives are supposed to respect organic institutions and then only reform them or change them when they need to. And sometimes they do. Is this one? Really? Is there something so wrong with the BBC? Is it delivering such bad value for money? 92% of the people in the UK use it every week for about 18 hours a week. Is it really doing that badly just because it used to be doing even better when there was no Netflix? Is Netflix so good that it does news? I haven't seen them do news. I haven't seen them do Afghanistan. I don't see them doing local news. I don't see them doing weather. I don't see them doing religion. I don't see them having an obligation to British talent. I see them have 15 billion quid of debt and a very good business model and do good stuff. But it's not the BBC, and Amazon Prime isn't the BBC, and Disney Plus isn't either. So if you care about British talent and British creativity, and the impact that the BBC can have on the creative industries as a whole, and the quality of the BBC's programming, imperfect and crazed though it sometimes is, then you have to say so. And you have to find people to write to and say, you're just wrong.
Okay.
I'm sorry, that's thought for the day, as it were, but that's what I think.
Well, I'm glad that my question specific to the World Service launched you on that passionate defense of the BBC. No, don't apologize for it. Yeah. As Aviva hinted, I'm seguing from asking a question to now doing the vote of thanks. I'm putting my chairman's hat on, you see, and doing the vote of thanks. What to you? It has been a fascinating hour and a half. I'm going to thank you for your candor, for your insights, for not shirking the awkward, difficult issues. But frankly, most of all, I'm going to thank you for that last 5 minutes of passion. I think probably most people on this session, certainly myself, are 100% with you. And all we can do is hope that somehow or another sense and objectivity will prevail. Because as you've pointed out, if government is objective about the BBC, then the BBC survives in some form or another, because of course the future will be different. But thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me to do it.
If we were live in the hall, I'd now ask everyone to put their hands together, but I'm sure that metaphorically that's what we're doing.
Well, it's very kind of you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to do it.
Thank you.
And thank you for your remarks at the end. Thank you all very much indeed. And good night.
And good night. But don't go away, everybody, because I've got one more thing to add. As I'm sure most people here will know, this has been a fascinating series on the BBC and the Jewish contribution to the BBC, Jews' contribution to the BBC. The latest in a series of sessions, courses even, that Jewish Renaissance Publishing has run with Lyons Learning. And I can't allow this moment to pass without a special thanks to Rabbi Sybil Sheridan, because she is stepping aside now from such a full-time, well, not such a major involvement with Lyons Learning and these sessions. It's about 18 months ago that Jewish Renaissance was approached by Lyons Learning to see if we were interested in working with LLP, Lyons Learning Project, on these courses. Surprisingly, we were quite keen. And the last 18 months, well, starting in September last year, we've had some fascinating courses that Rabbi Sybil has been enormously instrumental in helping to make happen. But as I say, she is now stepping aside. She's going to be spending more time on the amazing work that she does with Ukrainian refugees and her work with the Jews of Ethiopia. So good luck and power to you for the work you're going to continue to be doing, Sybil. But thank you enormously for coming to Jewish Renaissance in the first place, but then also in your contribution, your work over the last 15, 18 months to make these courses that we have been running with you happen, and happen with such vigor and intensity and information, and dare I use the word, entertainment and education. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a big surprise, but thank you. It's not goodbye, because I will continue to join as part of the audience for these fascinating series. I don't know whether this is a good time to plug our next series, which I still think of
Please
as
do.
ours, which is going to look at the Yishuv. That's the period of settlement in what was then Palestine, now Israel, from the time of the sort of Ottoman Empire through the British Mandate. So it's going to be a really fascinating series, and I certainly plan to be there, although not in an official capacity. But thank you very much, and hope to see you then.
Thank you again, Sybil. Thank you, Aviva. Vote of thanks to you two for your contribution to these sessions, for chairing so ably this evening. And on that note, thank you everyone for joining, and good evening.